Hello and welcome to the SportsPro podcast. I'm your host, Michael Long, and on this episode, we're going to be talking about an exciting new project we dropped just last month, in fact, called Impact X. Now, if you haven't seen it, we produced it in collaboration with our partners at SportQuake. Impact X, it's a bold new annual initiative from SportsPro, which spotlights the most impactful, most creative, and most effective partnerships in sport. So we're talking about unique collaborations, original, well-executed ideas that are cutting through the noise and really redefining the landscape of sports marketing and sports sponsorship, spanning everything from innovative uses of tech and compelling kind of athlete-led content campaigns to social impact initiatives and award-winning cultural crossovers. So there's a lot covered within this project. So if you've not yet seen it, I implore you to search SportsPro Impact X to find out more. You can head over to a dedicated website where you can access a full casebook breaking down no fewer than 50 of the best brand partnerships and activations in sport from the past 5 years. And we'll also drop a link right here in the show notes so you can head over there directly once you're done here. For now though, please do stick with us. I'm delighted to be joined by two members of our inaugural esteemed Impact X advisory panel who helped shape this project and whittle down the final collection of featured work. First up, we have Olivia Gillibrand, the CMO at SportQuake. Welcome, Olivia. Good to see you.
Hey, Mike. Good to see you too.
Also joining us, we have Steve Martin, founding partner, MSQ Sport and Entertainment. Welcome, Steve.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
Very well. It's very hot on this Friday afternoon. Hottest day of the year. Let's talk about one of the hottest projects of the year.
Perfect for a podcast, right?
Yes, indeed. Perfect timing for a podcast. Before we get into the conversation, I think, Liv, it's on us really just to frame the project, frame the concept. You know, as I mentioned, we set out to spotlight the most impactful, creative, and effective partnerships in sport. But what exactly does that mean? What's the big idea? What's the objective behind this project in your words?
So it's an interesting one. The concept really came out of a discussion with John Abrahams, the SportsPro COO, over coffee. And we were talking about the pressures that marketers are increasingly under and the sort of shift from such a heavy focus on performance marketing to perhaps a resurgence of brand marketing. And I was sort of talking about a bit of digital fatigue and consumers sort of getting more and more used to that. And how do you make performance marketing really hit the nail for you, and it's getting more and more expensive. And that sort of led back naturally, given where I work, into talking about sponsorship marketing as part of brand marketing. And that came with a sort of obvious question about how do you think about the impact of sponsorship marketing? Because that is the question that every marketer is asked in terms of, and I sort of would refer to it as you're sort of constantly playing in offense in terms of how am I going to deliver ROI? What's the campaign going to deliver? And that's what this report was sort of focused on bringing. Is it was never about spotlighting the biggest brands or the loudest partnerships. It was about showcasing what's possible with a sports partnership. Because, as I've said, it's very difficult to plan and buy in the space and get the right deal for your goals. And then to prove the impact of that is no easy task. So we really wanted to create a framework that goes beyond the obvious metrics, so that the report can really belong to those not who just shout the loudest, but those who really embed themselves with compelling stories, or in the case of someone like a Charlotte Tilbury, an F1 Academy, create an entirely new one.
As you say, so we were looking at across the full breadth of sport here, and when we got talking about this and refining the concept at the start of the year, really we didn't want to try and be too necessarily too objective, too exhaustive. We're not trying to capture kind of every single piece of work in the sports marketing space here, but we really wanted to position this as an exhibition of the best work. As you say, showcase why sports sponsorship works today, how to execute it well, how to ensure that you can kind of marry the dual imperatives, I guess, of creativity and performance to make sure, your sponsorship investment as a brand is working as hard as possible for your business. But why exactly did we choose to launch, now as well? What was the particular moment in time that we're kind of launching this project into? Because there are other initiatives out there around marketing effectiveness and sponsorship creativity and things like that. But what was the kind of the thinking behind doing so now? Obviously, 5 years on since since the pandemic when, the whole world changed, not just the marketing world?
I mean, it's remarkable to think that it's been 5 years since the pandemic. It almost seems like a very, very bad dream. Although the weather this summer is quite similar to that first lockdown when it was really warm. But it is sort of a good time to put it what I would call a marker in the sand. 5 years being a nice round number, 5, 10, 15, the good markers. But I think more importantly, since COVID, the industry has moved on. Technology has moved on. The way that we think about things has moved on. As consumers, the way that we interact with things, it's all changed. And this kind of concept of awareness and logos and eyeballs has really moved on to ideas and outcomes. And I think the Impact X collection really showcased that shift. When you think about someone like Ellie the elephant, how on earth would a mascot turn into a fashion icon, influencer, and a revenue driver? Or even if we think back to the Olympics last year, would you have thought in 2012, which I know is before the pandemic, that you'd see athletes taking selfies on a podium? That just wouldn't have been something. The selfie, I don't think, and I'm possibly showing my age here, that we took selfies in 2012, but it certainly wouldn't have been a mainstream part of the Olympics. And that's when you see them getting the biggest share of voice of any Olympic sponsor. That's when you see that things are moving on, technology is moving, consumers are moving in the way that it's the right time to put that marker in the sand. Because I think whether you're a legacy sponsor that's been involved with sponsorship marketing for years, or it's your first time into the space, that playbook has changed. And for me, as a marketer, one of the things I always think about is that brand awareness is really only half the battle, because brand relevance and advocacy ultimately are the true measures of success. And relevance is earned and can't be bought. And creativity plays a bigger role in creating that brand relevance and awareness, more so now than ever, as the battle for attention gets harder and harder and harder. And I think that that's only intensified since COVID. So it just felt like the right time to pop that marker in the sand.
Yeah, sure. And we'll come on to some specific work within the casebook shortly, and certainly the themes around the industry and around the collection generally shortly. But just to kind of bring everyone, listeners up to speed on kind of how we went about whistling down to this 50 strong casebook, if you like, and the kind of methodology process we went through. Obviously, we had put together a bit of advisory panel, so it wasn't all SportsPro and SportQuake. Obviously, both of you were members of that panel, but there are 9 individuals on it from the likes of F1, PTO, Stake, Standard Chartered, YouTube, TikTok, eToro. So we had a nice mix of brands and rights holders and platforms there. And really, as we've said, when we're talking about creativity, it's impossible to be truly objectives. Different brands have different objectives, and it was difficult to be exhaustive in our assessment because we cast our gaze back kind of 5 years back to COVID and how things have changed since then, and some of the best work. But we did have input from the kind of leading professionals in the space, which helped kind of bring some credibility and some stamp of approval to it. But in terms of our I guess our methodology, we had a kind of four-pronged approach of looking at the activation, how successful it was, how well it was executed, and things like that. The partner fit, so looking at how well the stakeholders, the brand, the rights holder were aligned in various ways. They're looking at the economic perspective, so things like return on investment and reported figures around the impact, measurable impact that the partnerships or activations had, and then the kind of wider brand impact and things like purchase consideration and things like that for the brand involved. So they were the kind of key criteria that we looked at in our assessment and through our research. But Liv, just to stick with you just a little bit longer, how would we define impact? Because I think when we were thinking about impact, and I know we've kind of touched on it already, but impact, the word impact means many things to many different people, and it has multiple definitions within the industry, certainly within sport these days. But yeah, how would you describe or define the word impact?
I think it comes back to that question I was talking about brand relevance in terms of the campaign that you're doing. And I think if you look at the Skoda Tour de France campaign, a car manufacturer is sponsoring a cycling race using an app, which, and forgive me if I've got this wrong, that Strava, I use it for running, but that seems quite a sort of contradiction in terms that if you're if you're a car manufacturer, why are you sponsoring something to do with cycling where people are on a different mode of transport and then using a running app? It just seems, but in terms of the impact that it makes it relevant for people. It reaches different people. It's very creative, and you definitely see that with other activations like the Seller Newcastle sound shirt. Again, how is that relevant for their brand in terms of awareness? But it's actually about inclusivity. And I think that impact can mean a number of different things to different people. I'd be really interested on Steve's take on this, because for me, it's not just about the numbers and those obvious metrics. It's about where can it take the brand to that next level through using the power of sport, emotion, and that cultural relevance. Because ultimately, and anyone who's ever worked with me will hear me say this, that the fan or the consumer is anyone who works in this industry's boss. We are ultimately answerable to them, and the campaigns that we have to look at are the ones that have had the most impact for fans and for consumers.
Yeah, Steve, very keen to bring you in here as well, actually, and just, what's your understanding? What's your, I guess, definition of, in your mind, the word impact in this kind of context of sponsorship and marketing?
It's a perennial debate, I have to say, about impact, but it's so nuanced now and so bespoke. I think there's no one size fits all. I think the sponsorship industry has been looking for years at this, what is the playbook to measure impact? And it's tortured itself. It's, nobody has ever really said they've cracked it. And I sort of think, well, that's not a surprise. I think at the end of the day, impact is what you define at the top of the show when you're going into a partnership. It's not at the end. It's always been brought to be, the last $10,000 in the pot. We'll do a bit of measurement to measure the impact. That's always been where the problems have I think, been lying within the industry. Whereas actually, if you define the reason why you're going in to create a partnership and, get your brand out there and really be ruthless at the top of that, because it's so different to some brands. I mean, you'll have brand challenges will be, we need to continue to build big brand awareness, because there's been a race to the bottom, and sort of performance marketing, as Olivia was saying, a while ago it was all about, let's digitize everything we're doing and become a social media led business. Well, actually, we've seen that, how the impact that has had on the likes of Nike, for example, where their share price has fallen through the floor, and actually they've taken their eye off the ball from brand building. But what was the impact that we're trying to create? Like, was that even discussed? It was sort of looking at what channels they could market to and where their fans were, as opposed to looking at the top, what we're trying to measure and put KPIs in before you even start anything.
Couldn't agree more, Steve. I think that kind of upfront, what do you want to achieve, is when you really make a successful partnership.
It is, and like, we as an agency, Landy, we've been really hard on ourselves, I have to say, because we see this obviously with a portfolio of clients. It's not through one, but each and every one is so nuanced, and they're in it for a different reason. We're working with Howden, for example, on the British and Irish Lions at the moment. It's a mega partnership, and their objectives would be completely different to something like we're working on Callaway. On their partnerships, and everything would be different from a Glenfiddich to Aston Martin Formula One. There's different reasons. So I just like us to get away from this one size fits all and be really focused on what business impact is and what brand impact is, because they're two very different things. But agree it all and stop worrying about this sort of, holistic approach to it in the industry. It doesn't exist and shouldn't exist.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, that's the spirit in which we certainly approach this project, is not generalizing, not trying to compare apples to apples and tried to come up with some objective assessment or ranking. As I was saying, it was really just a collection of just fantastic work within its context of its time that really just cuts through in various ways. Yes, it performs for the business and brands involved, but it has an external impact. It's really getting people talking, it's turning heads, it's understanding of the audience is emotionally resonant. There's that social layer as well. If that's the objective, to drive positive change, to what extent has it benefited those communities and kind of performed against that objective. But let's move on to the casebook itself and those, as I said, 50 partnerships and activations within it. Altogether, 41 brands featured across those 50 partnerships. So a few that appeared more than once. 16 sports in total, I think, featured in multiple markets where those partnerships have been activated. But really, this is a mix of, as we've been saying, different companies of different scales from different sectors, different categories, multinationals, smaller players. We've got emerging and established brands in there. There's lots of different sports and things like that. So, question for you both, really: what were your kind of initial reflections on the featured work? Are there some standout examples, standout case studies for you, or just general reflections on the overall kind of complexion of the collection?
I think the one of the most interesting parts of this project was actually stopping and looking back, because we're all working at 200 miles an hour in this game, and it's you never stop and go, well, let's have a real consideration of what's working, what's not, what impact things are having, what you're actually entertained by and enjoy. At the end of the day, we're in this, but whether you're a brand, an agency, or whatever the ecosystem around the sports and sponsorship industry, we're in it to enjoy the work and actually try and create a difference, because it's becoming incredibly competitive. And I think when you looked at the list, it's so diverse, the list, and it was really, really hard to get it to 50. So I think what's happened post-COVID, as Olivia had pointed to, it's been an explosion of great work. And if you think about why that's happened, well, there was a lot of, when you take things away from people, they wanted even more, and particularly around experiential. And if you get a lot of the work that's come out of the blocks in the last 2 or 3 years has been experientially led and live, which is lovely, because that's right in the sweet spot of where fans are and fan behavior. And then the content is socialized across multiple channels. So, you've seen so much good work. And I think getting to the 50 when we were debating it on the panel was bloody hard to do. But there's some things I still really like. And I love things that have got a story and resonate and make you feel something. The emotion that sport and entertainment can bring to you should come through in the work. And it's hard to do that. And I think some of the work that I've seen over the last few years, and even very recently, has been back to this brand building thing. And that really resonates with me, that we're seeing a move back to that, from that race to the bottom performance media, digital only. It's been okay, but I think now we're seeing the elevation again in the industry, and big moments. And I give examples of like Adidas landing the Hey Jude film, right in the sweet spot of the Euros, was terrific. And that becomes a cultural moment that's so really hard to do. You can't force that, but you've got to be, your planning has to be world class. And I think they knew, and I heard about this film that was coming for quite a while before it landed. And when it did land, it really resonated. So I've loved that. I've loved the braveness of LVMH, because I think that's been the game changer in terms of Olympic marketing. The Olympics has gone through, I would say, I've worked in many Olympics. I'm very, very privileged to have done that for 25, 30 years. I think Paris was the complete refresh of Olympic marketing. It was a massive success, and there was real skepticism going into Paris, because it's like, what are they going to do? Here's another Olympics. Do the youth care? Do the audiences care? Does the broadcasters care? Well, boy, everybody cared, and I think it was the best Olympics bar none. And I would say London was in 2012 was exceptional, but I would say that it was so good. And then from a pure sponsorship lens, I just really liked LVMH's portfolio approach, turning up with multiple brands and surprising you. Everything was there. It didn't feel clunky. You know, yes, showing Louis Vuitton cases and around the trophies and everything. I thought Samsung did a brilliant job, as we just hinted on. I didn't feel that I was watching something making me cringe, ironically. I thought, oh, I thought that was nice. So that's been a game changer for me. And I think this move back to big brand plays on the list was the bit that, if you were to do this list 2 years ago, it would be substantially changed. And I think something like On Running, which is obviously with Federer's investment in that brand, has been one of the real rising stars. There's a lot of brave moves in that brand, and the success has been directly reflected on their share price. So that's how you measure impact. So we're not going to go through every one of them, but I think there's been that rise of big brand plays with emotion engaged, and part of it has been the big step change for me.
I completely agree. I think that there are some really great big brand plays, which, as we were talking about at the beginning, for me is it's actually a really exciting shift in marketing I'd say back to my roots in terms of brand marketing. Because I think it allows you to have that creativity and that freedom of expression and to build a brand that people emotionally connect to rather than one that's just driven on how many clicks and what's your PPC and what's your click-through rate and what's your CPM on this. And I think that it's all important, and I absolutely get that from a bottom line perspective, but you still can't beat those emotional moments where you really connect with a brand. I think the thing that also really stood out to me was the rise of purpose-driven marketing, and I think that's becoming more and more important. When we look at the Samaritans Norwich City campaign, for example, that was forwarded on to me a few times. It did actually probably make me quite emotional at the time when I watched it. Again, when you look at the sound shirt for Newcastle, and particularly when you look in the growth of women's sport, I think women are brilliant brand ambassadors. Naturally, we recommend things to our friends, but women like brands that represent women's sport or sponsor women's sport. And I think that people feeling they're investing in their community, that continued drive of purpose-driven marketing and purposeful campaigns that do a little bit more than just elevate a brand presence was really great to see.
I think you're right. I think you can, over the last few years, particularly coming out of COVID, everybody was walking on eggshells. A lot of brands tiptoeing around, and purpose became engulfing. And actually, it became dry in the end and flat and boring. And I'd turn up to a lot of the awards things and be like, "How did that win?" Like, I get it. It was sort of overly purposeful, if you know what I mean. And
Yeah,
um, at the end of the day, what we're doing, you have to look through the lens of fans in most sports, and you should, for obvious reasons. But fans can be, a very diverse bunch across multiple sports and who you're trying to reach in different ages groups, like a whole lot. But I think purpose became too engulfing and actually started to hold the industry back, and everything became quite boring. So what you're now seeing, and that's not being flippant, by the way. I really don't want to, think that you think I'm thinking that. Do you know what I mean? I want that to be about how we use it from an entertaining, engaging way to create action as opposed to purpose for purpose sake, because it felt like a lot of campaigns were pretty boring. Whereas what we're seeing is a bit of a shift into this entertainment lens, and F1 has been the rocket ship and all that, where you've got a convergence of lifestyle, fashion, music, everything that's been brought to the play. And I think what we're seeing, purpose can have a heartbeat to it and an emotional, and can be fun and light and entertaining. And that's your dynamite. So that's certainly the challenge we are trying at MSQ, for example, with the team, of adding that creative flair back into the industry, because I'm not saying it's gone away, but it's been hidden. And I think a lot of the work that's coming through is starting to see that entertainment lens on things, not, as I say, in a flippant or loose way, but social purpose can also be really impactful when it makes you do something and feel something, as opposed to just a message being thrown at you. And I think that's where we're seeing a step change, which I think will only benefit the industry over the next few years.
completely agree, Steve. I mean, if you look at the Paddy Power 180 campaign, I mean, sports betting gets an incredibly bad rep within sport and generally as an industry. And that's someone turning it onto its head, but it's purpose with entertainment. It's making it part of the event. It's making it fun. It's not sort of throwing it down. Prostate cancer is an incredibly serious discussion, but they've done it in a way that makes it feel approachable and something that people can get behind. And that is when you make real change rather than sort of, as you say, pushing it in a way that people sort of shy and pull back from.
I agree.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, I guess, the longevity of some of these campaigns and ideas, that's the true test of the kind of sincerity and the authenticity of that purpose that underpins them almost. It's like if they're continuing and having a genuine impact, then, that's, that's why they're going to continue. I think one of the interesting things that came through in the kind of collection in Impact X was the way in which some of the work kind of really marries a few of these different things together at the same time. So they're purpose driven, but they're also very tech enabled. They're fan centric. They're crossover into other realms of entertainment and culture and things like that. So I think, when you think about Wimbledon and Vodafone, and they give vision activation for visually impaired fans, and you mentioned Liv's the Newcastle and Seller Unsilence the Crowd campaign, which was fantastic in terms of like a tech-enabled, piece of equipment that can enable deaf fans to experience a football match in a completely different way. But then all of the content that they produced around that as well to really bring that to life and tell that story, I think was fantastic. And then I guess one thing, when we started digging into it and looking at the research, and one of the brands that came up a few times was Michelob Ultra, a very kind of established player in sports sponsorship, a traditional category as a brewer, but really just through the work that they've put out, they're really thinking outside the box, them and their agency, in terms of how they activate in kind of non-traditional ways. And there's the Dreamcaster activation for a kind of basketball fan and wannabe kind of broadcaster, which was fantastic. The work they did with John McEnroe. So there was a lot of work that they were doing as well. So I think, do you feel like, would both of you agree that perhaps some of these the new tech, the new thinking, the new brands coming to the fore has really forced established players as well to really up their game as well, and just think differently, and think outside of their traditional perhaps approach that their category or they've typically taken?
I'd agree to some extent, but I think that perhaps have also just thought about, going back to the point that Steve made, is what are they trying to achieve themselves? Because if you look at OKX, for example, they were in there twice, two very different campaigns. The Legends piece they did with Formula One and Ayrton Senna, which for me really stood out as kind of a brand that's leaning very much into the future thinking, and that very much forward-looking play is looking backwards, but really tapping into that F1 nostalgia. And then the other side is their Manchester City campaign, which is step into the OKX verse, which couldn't be sort of more of an opposite. But both were done reflecting the distinct cultures, the audiences, and the brand profiles of the F1 fan, of the McLaren fan, and Manchester City. And both campaigns were incredibly impactful and had great results, but both felt really authentic and did a different job for the brand. So I think it's, again, they're not perhaps looking at what other people are doing, but other people should be perhaps looking at them to think about, it isn't just about how do I place my logo for brand awareness, it's that's part of the battle, but then how do I activate so that I can make my brand really exciting for people?
Each one of them, though, Michael, has a story at heart. So how they've rolled it out using tech has been very impressive, but each one of them has a story at the start of the show. And I think that's what I've liked. So they're then driven. I mean, I think when we were going through the list, how when you get something as simple at the top and you understand what the message is, and then how you drive that through various content and through live experience with all your channels to get to your fan base, that's the bit that I've liked. So Sella, I thought was terrific actually around Newcastle United. I think what you say, the OKX stuff has been quite diverse actually, how they've used things and been quite playful with the brand. Okay, it's a crypto brand, so you probably can be that. Obviously lives in the digital world, but they've brought that brand out of their digital ecosystem, which I think has been quite nice. But it's how they've activated through multiple channels to me has been really quite interesting. And going back to some of the channels with the likes of Michelob and Heineken around 0-0, for example, that's been a whole new category that's been created around sponsorship, really. So obviously Heineken's one of the most famous sponsors brands around, as is Guinness. Michelob have been around US sport for years, but they've been allowed to then play, whether we're around the edges, obviously promoting non-drink driving and, behavioral campaigns. They've now been right in the sweet spot. So they've shifted their brand into the heartbeat of the sports because of these zero products. So that's been a terrific shift and a new creative challenge for them. But I've really enjoyed that work. I've loved what Guinness have done, I have to say, in the last while. It didn't make our list here, but I think it would make the list going forward. And Heineken, I think, have done a really nice job around F1. The juxtaposition of don't drink and drive actually doesn't play out anymore because they've got this beautiful, 0-0 product, which is performing really well, as are many of the brands. So But it comes back to what they've got at the show and the simplicity around the message, and then the creative concepts, and how they've used tech then to amplify that has really been the bit that we've seen. Probably the last 12 months, you've seen a lot of great work in that space.
I guess it's thinking of, rather than just a simple sponsorship play, is really thinking about it in the way that you think about any marketing campaign, is kind of what's the story and how's that going to flow through. And I think that's been a big shift for me, is watching people think that sponsorship marketing is a main part of your brand marketing. It can have a huge halo effect for any other campaign that you're running. And it's a great way, it's one of your ultimate brand platforms, because naturally people connect much more with sport than they do with other advertising.
Well, that's so true, Olivia. And I think we've seen in the last, well, I don't talk how long I've been in this industry, but I think, the last 10 years, when the sponsorship department used to sit out in this parallel universe within marketing organizing businesses, they've suddenly realized, no, that's part of the marketing department. It was like the PR team used to be the same, bring
Yeah.
it all in, and the best brands have it all joined up. And they're using it because everything's so competitive at the minute. If you look at banks or telcos or soft drinks or watches or cars, like, your competitive set is extraordinary, and everybody's using sponsorship really smartly, and they can have multiple brands in those industries, but it helps them differentiate. So that's the reason why we've seen the explosion of sponsorship. But they finally realized you bring that in to lead your brand. It's not the only thing, it's part of your mix, but it can add emotion and differentiate. And I think that's where we've seen the brands that are doing that very obviously have their sponsorship team as part of their overall brand marketing. And that's where it has maximum impact, as opposed to just in this parallel universe.
I think that's what makes it most exciting, is because then you're going to see much more creativity, because you're treating it like you would a proper brand marketing campaign, as you say, rather than being someone who's just sitting down the corridor in a dusty office that's sort of forgotten about, and the logo. Oh yeah, we just saw a bit of logo placement. Great, brilliant.
Yeah, and I think O2 have been the best at that. I mean, we've seen that for years. They've been the best at bringing it into a major brand play, not a sponsorship play, a brand play. And actually, that's why they've had probably the most enduring partnerships. I think England Rugby's been 30 years. Their music platforms have been so enduring, and it all's converged into one thing, but it leads the charge within the brand. So there's a lot of things like we're continually learning, aren't we, and bouncing off each other. And I think one of the great parts of this Impact X has been actually to look at just the diversity of stuff and pick and choose and learn all the time, which I think anyone who has time to pile into those case studies, I would really urge them to do it. Certainly we've been saying that to our team, because you don't realize what you've learned until you just read this stuff and you go, oh, I love that, and you'll pick up a few tricks of the trade and keep going.
Yeah, it's great to hear you say that, Steve, because one of our for SportsPro, SportQuake, for Livs and I, the aspirations of this project is not just to produce gather together a collection of work that we've curated and move on. We want to use this as a platform to bring people together, to kind of share ideas, as I was saying before, best practice, do workshops, share ideas, and just drive the industry forward, and just kind of progress the ideas, progress the standard of the work, and play a role in that. So that's, in terms of where we see this project going, we're sat here in year one and we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but we want to have a meaningful impact through this project by having an impact on the industry and bringing people together, which is, always been SportsPro's intention as well around our events and conferences and content and things. So that's the aspiration for it. But just to come back to a couple of things you were saying, what we were talking about before around the attention economy, and just the extent to which you've got to kind of cut through now. You've got to be in the right places to reach your audience. Attention is fractured and splintered across so many different platforms now. And one of the things that shines through in the work that we featured in Impact X is definitely that kind of approach to just embracing those new media platforms and online communities and things like that, where I think they call it the third space or something now, really tapping into where sport is being consumed now. People aren't just beaming into the broadcast and watching live events. It's all of everything that goes on around the main event and the discussion. And as a brand, if you can earn the right to play there through, a consistent, authentic message, then that's where you're really tapping into that emotional resonance, relevance, cultural relevance that is so sought after through marketing campaigns these days. So when we look at the activations, Liv, you mentioned Strava before, but these stories, these brand campaigns and partnerships are really being brought to life through YouTube, through TikTok, Discord, WhatsApp. WhatsApp actually features through its work with Mercedes. But would you say now that's a necessity to really think, okay, where is my audience? Where are they consuming the sport in question? Where do I need to be? And when you're kind of planning an activation and just planning where you're positioning this, where you're telling the stories, that's got to come first. You can't expect people to just kind of gravitate towards you and that's it.
I think it goes back to thinking about what your goals are and then ultimately who your audience are, and really knowing who your audience are. It's so important to know them. And I think also thinking it not a sport in isolation. Sport is part of life. It's part of entertainment. You're not just competing for time on a Saturday. I mean, I'm going to show my age, but when you used to sit down as a family to watch Match of the Day for a certain period at a certain set time or watch a game, that doesn't happen anymore. You're constantly always on, whether it's in a WhatsApp group discussing what's happening or talking about the Andy Murray playing golf against Carlito. It's constant, it's everywhere. And so you've got to think about how do you make your brand fit in with that ecosystem. And in terms of the attention economy, because it's everywhere, you're not just competing for sport time, you're competing for consumer time and consumer focus. So you have to make sure that it connects with them in an engaging way.
Yeah, and I guess, from my point of view, it's got to be heavily curated against each of the channels. So the game changes that it's not one size fits all. So, the difference between, this is pretty obvious though, but the difference between the tone and style of an Instagram reel versus a LinkedIn versus a Snap versus, TikTok versus Roblox.
Roblox is a whole nother world, isn't it?
It is, but it's a world that's there and it cannot be ignored. And we are torturing ourselves as an agency to move with the times, and everyone will be. And the content we're creating and the privileged access we get to athletes and talent and shoots and stuff. I mean, I would say the value of the cutting room floor has never been greater, of all the stuff that you get from behind the scenes and how you carve that up across multiple channels to add value and bring an audience in and bring them part of the journey and see stuff you'd never normally see because you can't be there on a live moment. It's sitting there for us all as brand marketeers and sponsorship marketeers, but it has to be so well curated, and you need a really deep specialist understanding of how those work, because you can get it spectacularly wrong and you can get it spectacularly right. But I've loved the fact that, there's a constant demand for innovation, and big brands are playing in, 18 months of winning TikTok. And TikTok is one of the most commercial vehicles you can see, as well as a content driver, because the impact it has on sales is absolutely dramatic. Particularly around, nostalgia and fashion. Look what Adidas was being one of the Trojan horses in TikTok. I mean, absolutely amazing. And it's a direct impact on its sales, not just its brand. So we've got a lot of channels out there that we haven't had before that brands can play in, but you've got to get it right. And there's a lot of pitfalls on it. So, the investment in that social and digital understanding is not going away. And as you say, there's about, how Roblox is becoming a player within that space as well is actually intriguing. It's not just a gaming brand, it's how that was suddenly resonating in sports content as well. And actually brands are creating their own content within that space. So it's, I would say our list will be so changeable within the next 12 months and heavily digitized, but it's about the ones that are going to stand out, have that big brand play at the top of it, and then it's how you curate it through these multiple channels available to us.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you both in a second about partnerships, campaigns, activations that are currently happening now that didn't feature in the list, that maybe are too recent to feature, but actually certainly ones to consider next year. So maybe have a little think about that for now. But just because we to wrap this up, a couple more questions. So would you say, just to summarize this whole kind of conversation and distill this project down into a bit of a playbook for brands, would you say there is a playbook for building those meaningful, impactful collaborations and partnerships between brands and rights holders? What are those key ingredients that simply cannot be overlooked? They have to be there to drive impact. I know we said before, let's not generalize because you need to take everything case by case, but certain things, if it has to boil down to kind of a handful of things, what would they be?
There isn't a playbook, but there are certain steps in the process that you need to follow. And I think the most important step is almost the first phase before you begin, is that discovery phase. And I think back to SportsPro Live and some of the brand forum discussions, it's about really thinking about what you want to achieve. Can the rights holder help you to achieve that? Is it right for their fan base and audience? Because you might have very set goals, but that might alienate some of their fan base, and they know their fan base incredibly well. And as Steve said, you can do things spectacularly well and you can do them spectacularly badly. So it's making sure that you're finding upfront your match made in heaven. I think that's the key learning for me for any successful partnership.
I guess as well, as to people that work at agencies, I guess get yourself a fantastic agency is probably a high up on the list as well.
Well said, Michael. Well said. Yeah, I think, look, the challenge is a pretty perennial challenge, though, to all brands. It's how we're going to engage with the audience. What does that look like, consistently? How can we make it enduring? Yes, you're going to have sort of, tactical flair points that you can get involved with and be part of culture, but the challenge is actually planning. I think one of the things that we're blessed with now, with particularly around digital and social media, you can get to understand the sentiment around an audience very, very easily. It's quite transparent. You can do social listening around what things are happening. So I think there's a big play into audience behavior and insight, which will fuel things. But we're finding certainly that things are becoming more strategic again. And if you get a really world-class strategy, which you have a really, merge that with a really rich understanding of your audience, then your creative brief is going to be 1,000,000 times better. So we're been really hard on ourselves in that. And I think a lot of brands you're seeing here will probably have really terrific strategy at its heart, which allows the brief to the creative directors, creative department, to be much easier because everybody knows what they're running at and absolute clarity. So if you've got clarity at the top of what you're trying to achieve and what impact you're trying to achieve, which we've discussed earlier, but then you can come up with some big, bold ideas that are really going to cut through against that. Well, that's the phase I think we're going to in the industry. And I think that's where it's getting its rock and roll back. That, there's exciting. And then, some of the work that we've seen has really started to create that perception again of big stuff that makes you feel emotional, makes you care, makes you want to share. And I think that's where we're quite excited about the next phase. But the hard yards that you don't see in agency land and, creative department, marketing departments is that massive strategic understanding and audience understanding. And then it's bloody hard to come up with really creative stuff, but it's made easier if you get the first bit right.
Nice. So just come back to that question to round this to wrap this up. That question about ones to watch. I mean, F1 Lego is often spoken about. Certainly, has been over the last couple of months. But any others maybe bubbling under the radar that perhaps listeners aren't aware of that you should keep tabs on, keep an eye on between now and Impact X Year 2 next summer?
You picked my, I loved the Lego cars and I loved the Lego trophy this weekend, but it's an interesting one. I think of, I think F1 generally is light years ahead of some of the other federations in terms of what they've done to really get to know their audience, which can really help brands in terms of doing those brand building campaigns. But the real crossover when you look at the F1 movie, that's brilliant. I know that the diehard F1 fans, it perhaps wasn't the greatest, but for someone who just enjoyed it from a branding perspective, I thought it was fabulous. But I think that's an interesting case study because when you look at Expensify, for example, the amount of publicity that they've had, the uplifts that they've had has been fantastic. And that's a fictional team. that you can also now play on EA Sports, and just that blending. I think we're going to see a continual blending of entertainment and sport, and I think that will be a very interesting way to look at things going forward.
Yeah, I thought that was great actually, and we've done it in the right way. It didn't feel like it was so contrived, which it really could have been. So I thought that was quite smart. I'd be quite like to be. I've been part of that, I have to say. And then, yeah, we'll be talking about Lego for quite a while. I think Lego as a brand is an extraordinary brand. Their tech capability is the big sort of golden goose in that business, because they can build anything. So to go build Formula One cars that can actually be sort of driven, or Formula style cars that can be driven was
Wild.
it's terrific. And it'll be years and months in planning that. That isn't that's what I'm talking about, strategic understanding and impact that you don't see. That is beautifully executed as well, I have to say. So, getting the drivers to do it and all the rest. So that'll be a case study that will be used for the next 20 years, which is great. The stuff I've really liked recently, I love what Evian do. I think Evian have a real social purpose, and obviously it's live around because we're in Wimbledon, coming to the end of Wimbledon, obviously this weekend. But I've experienced that a few times. I think it's brilliant what Evian do, because it isn't just a badging exercise. The whole refilling and water education, the purposeful around their product. How they've used their ambassadors has been really smart. I've loved what they've done for years, but I thought they've added a real social heartbeat to it that is actually, it's not forced. So that's one to watch. For say, I think, but you're going to see the next few years, you're going to see a big comeback from Nike, I suspect. It's always been seen as the sponsored dreamy brand. I think Adidas has nicked an enormous amount of market share from them. Adidas has been leaning into nostalgia. I think they've been playing on music. Look what they're doing with Oasis at the minute. And that collection has been very smart, what they've done around Glastonbury, using those cultural moments. They've been eating Nike's breakfast for quite a while, but I think you're going to see them come back. And I think there's going to be a real third party in this thing with On and Hoka, which we've seen around the running brand. On is an extraordinary brand that's so playful, so brave, trying things. And then we'll keep an eye on Formula One. Obviously, Formula One's one part of it, but it's incredibly saturated now. It's 200-mile-an-hour billboard, really. So how do you, the creative challenge around those brands and making it more than the B2B hospitality play will be the thing, because there's a lot of brands aren't activating well around F1. They're doing the deals, and I think the activation's been quite flat. So there's an opportunity around that. But there's the beauty of our industry, it never stops. We've got to be learning all the time, which is why I've decided to go again with an MSQ and have another go at another agency. But I think it's never ending, and it keeps us all on our toes and entertained. And I've loved this exercise to stop and have a look and open the box of tricks that these case studies have shown, because there's still incredible learning there, but there's some brilliant case studies that make you feel quite emotional, and that's what our game should be.
Lovely stuff. Well, we will have to wrap it there, but thank you to both of you for your time. Thank you for your support for the project. It's been a pleasure to work with you, Livs, and the SportQuake team on kind of getting this off the ground, and really excited to see where we take it next. And obviously watch this space, with all of the fantastic work that is taking place within the industry. There's so much more content besides the collection of work that we put together over on sportspro.com and across our channels. There'll be plenty more to come in due course. Please do go and download the full casebook to dig a little deeper if you so wish. But yeah, thank you to our guests. Thank you to everyone for listening. Goodbye. Thank you.